All right. So here we are, February 6th, wow, 2024. It's Spoken World Online, week number 204, I believe, this week, 204. And I have been reading Lean Times in Longbar by Fritz Leiber for many weeks, and we're now into the climatic scene of that story. And Fafford has appeared and has been believed to be the manifestation of the god Isaac of the Jug. Oops, excuse me. No, sorry, technical issues. Hold on. Not now. I don't want to change my browser now. Okay, so here comes the story. Yes, Quach and Wiggin rushed forward, but almost immediately came to a halt in the very strange posture of men who are trying to lift themselves into the air by heaving at their own belts. The short swords would not come out of their scabbards. Mingled glue is indeed a powerful adhesive, and the Mauser had been most determined that however little else he accomplished, Plug's henchmen should be put in a position where they could harm no one. However, he had been able to do nothing in the way of pulling Grilly's fangs, as the tiny man was most sharp-witted himself, and Pulg had kept him close at his side. Now, almost foaming at the mouth in vulpine rage and disgust, Grilly broke loose from his god-besotted master, whisked out his razor, and sprang at Fafford, who at last had clearly realized what was encumbering him and was having a fine time breaking the last pesky fragments of the bed over his knee or by the leverage of foot against cobble, to the accompaniment of the continuing wild cheers of the mob. But the Mauser sprang rather more swiftly. Grilly saw him coming, shifted his attack to the gray-clad man, feigned twice, and loosed one slash that narrowly missed. Thereafter, he lost blood too quickly to be interested in attempting any further fencing. Cat's claw is narrow, but it cuts throats as well as any other dagger, though it does not have a sharply curved or barbed tip, as some literal-minded scholars have claimed. The bout with Grilly left the Mauser standing very close to Fafford. The little man realized he still held in his left hand the golden representation of the jug fashioned by Fafford, and that object now touched off in the Mauser's mind a series of inspirations leading to actions that followed one another very much like the successive figures of a dance. He slapped Fafford backhanded on the cheek to attract the giant's attention. Then he sprang to Plug, sweeping his left hand in a dramatic arc, as if conveying something from the naked god to the extortioner, and lightly placed the golden bauble in the supplicating fingers of the latter. One of those times he had come when all ordinary scales of value fail, even for the Mauser, and gold is, however briefly, of no worth. Recognized the holy object, Pulg almost expired in ecstasy. But the Mauser had already skipped on across the street, reaching Isaac's copper altar, beside which Boadres was stretched unconscious, but smiling. He twitched off the garlic bag and sprang upon the small cask and danced upon it, hooting and to further attract Fafford's attention, and then pointing at his own feet. Fafford saw the cask all right, as the Mauser had intended he should, and the giant did not see it as anything to do with Isaac's collections. The thought of all such matters was still wiped from his mind, but simply as a likely source of the liquor he craved. With a glad cry, he hastened toward it across the street, his worshippers scuttling out of his way or moaning in beatific ecstasy when he trod on them with his naked feet. He caught up the cask and lifted it to his lips. To the crowd, it seemed that Isaac was drinking his own coffer, an unusual yet undeniably picturesque way for a god to absorb his worshippers' cask offerings. With a roar of baffled disgust, Fafford raised the cask to smash it on the cobbles, whether from pure frustration or with some idea of getting at the liquor he thought it held is hard to say. But just then the Mauser caught his attention again. The small man had snatched 2 tankards of ale from an abandoned tray and was pouring the heady liquid back and forth between them until the high piled foam trailed down the sides. Tucking the cask under his left arm, for many drunkards have a curious, prudent habit of absent-mindedly hanging on to things, especially if they may contain liquor. Fafford sat out again after the Mauser, who ducked into the darkest of the nearest portico and then danced out again and led Fafford in a great circle all the way around the rolling congregation. Literally viewed, it was hardly an edifying spectacle. A large god stumbling after a small gray demon and grasping at a tankard of beer that just kept eluding him. But the Lankmarians were already viewing it under the guise of 24 different allegories and symbolisms, several of which were later written up in learned scrolls. The second time through the portico, Isaac and the small gray demon did not come out again. A large chorus of mixed voices kept up expectant and fearful cries for some time, but the 2 supernatural beings did not reappear. Lankmar is full of mazy alleyways, and this stretch of the Street of the Gods is particularly rich in them, some of them leading by dark and circuitous routes to localities as distant as the docks. But the Isakians, old-timers and new converts alike, largely did not even consider such mundane avenues in analyzing their god's disappearance. Gods have their own doorways into and out of space and time, and it is their nature to vanish suddenly and inexplicably. Brief reappearances are all we can hope for from a god whose chief life drama on Earth has already been played, and indeed it might prove uncomfortable if he hung around very long. Protracting a second coming, too great a strain on everybody's nerves for one thing. The large crowd of those who had been granted the vision of Isaac was slow in dispersing, as might well have been expected. They had much to tell each other, much about which to speculate, and inevitably to argue. The blasphemous attack of Quach and Wigan on the god was belatedly recalled and avenged, though some already viewed the incident as part of a general allegory. The 2 bullies were lucky to escape with their lives after an extensive mauling. Grilly's corpse was unceremoniously picked up and tossed in next morning's death cart. End of his story. Boadres came out of his faint with Pulg bending solicitously over him, and it was largely these 2 persons who shaped the subsequent history of Issacanity. To make a long, or rather complex story simple and short, Pulg became what can best be described as Isaac's Grand Vizier and worked tirelessly for Isaac's greater glory, always wearing on his chest the gold-created golden emblem of the jug as the sign of his office. He did not, upon his conversion to the gentle God, give up his old profession, as some moralists might expect, but carried it on with even greater zeal than before, extorting mercilessly from the priests of all gods other than Isaac and grinding them down. At the height of his success, Issacanity boasted 5 large temples in Lankmar, numerous minor shrines in the same city, and a swelling priesthood under the nominal leadership of Boadres, who was lapsing once more into general senility. Issacanity flourished for exactly 3 years under Pulg's viziership, but when it became known, due to some incautious babblings of Boadres, that Pulg was not only conducting under the guise of extortion a holy war on all other gods in Lankmar, with the ultimate aim of driving them from the city, and if possible from the world, but that he even entertained murky designs of overthrowing the gods of Lankmar. or at least forcing them to recognize Issik's overlordship. When all this became apparent, the doom of Issacanity was sealed. On the third anniversary of Issik's second coming, the night descended ominous and thickly foggy, the sort of night when all wise Lakmarians hug their indoor fires. About midnight, awful screams and piteous howlings were heard throughout the city, along with the rending of thick doors and the breaking of heavy masonry. Preceded and followed, some tumultuously maintained, by the clicking tread of bones on the march. One youth who peered out through an attic window lived long enough before he expired in gibbering madness to report that he had seen, striding through the streets, a multitude of black-togaed figures, sooty of hand, foot, and feature, and skeletally lean. Next morning, the 5 temples of Issyk were empty and defiled, and his minor shrines all thrown down. While his numerous clergy, including his ancient high priest and overweeningly ambitious grand vizier, had vanished to the last member and were gone beyond human ken. Turning back to a dawn exactly 3 years earlier, we find the Grey Mouser and Fafford clambering from a cranky, leaky skiff into the cockpit of a black sloop moored beyond the great mole that juts out from Lochmar and the east bank of the River Hall into the inner sea. Before coming aboard, Fafford first handed up Issik's cask to the impassive and sallow-faced Orf, and then with considerable satisfaction pushed the skiff wholly underwater. The cross-city run the Mauser had led him on, followed by a brisk spell of galley slave work at the oars of the skiff, for which he need indeed look the part in his lean near nakedness, had quite cleared Fafford's head of the fumes of wine, though now it ached villainously. The Mauser still looked a bit sick from his share in the running. He was truly in woefully bad trim from his months of lazy gluttony. Nevertheless, the twain joined with Orf in the work of upping anchor and making sail. Soon a salty, coldly refreshing wind on their starboard beam was driving them directly away from the land and Lochmar. Then while Oomph fussed over Fafford and bundled a thick cloak about him, the Mauser turned quickly in the morning dusk to Issik's cask, determined to get at the loot before Fafford had opportunity to develop any silly religious or northernly nobile qualms, and perhaps toss the cask overboard. The Mauser's fingers did not find the coin slit in the top. It was still quite dark, so he upended the pleasantly heavy object, crammed so full it did not even jingle. No coin slit in that end either, seemingly, though there was what looked like a burned inscription in Lakmarian hieroglyphs, but it was still too dark for easy reading, and Fafford was coming up behind him. So the Mauser hurriedly raised the heavy hatchet he had taken from the sloop's tool rack and bashed in a section of wood. There was a spray of stingingly aromatic fluid of most familiar odor. The cask was filled with brandy to the absolute top, so that it had not gurgled. A little later, they were able to read the burnt inscription. It was most succinct. Dear Plug, drown your sorrows in this, Basharat. It was only too easy to realize how yesterday afternoon the number 2 extortioner had had a perfect opportunity to effect the substitution. The street of the gods deserted, Padres almost drunkenly asleep from the unaccustomedly large fish dinner, Fafford gone from his post to guzzle with the Mauser. That explains why Basharat was not on hand last night, the Mauser said thoughtfully. Fafford was for throwing the cask overboard, not from any disappointment at losing loot because of a revulsion in its contents, but the Mauser set aside the cask for Orf to close and store away. He knew that such revulsions passed. Fafford, however, extorted the promise that the fiery fluid only be used in direst emergency, as for burning enemy ships. I'm going to plow through to the end here. The red dome of the sun pushed above the eastern waves. By its ruddy light, Thafford and the Mauser really looked at each other for the first time in months. The wide sea was around them. Oomph had taken the lines and tiller, and at last nothing pressed. There was an odd shyness in both their gazes. Each had the sudden thought that he had taken his friend away from the life path he had chosen in Lochmar, perhaps the life path best suited to his treading. Your eyebrows will grow back, I suppose, the Mauser said at last, quite inanely. They will indeed, Fafford rebelled. I'll have a fine shock of hair by the time you've worked off that belly. Thank you, Eggtop, the Mauser replied. Then he gave a small laugh. I have no regrets for Lochmar, he said, lying mightily, though not entirely. I can see now that if I'd stayed, I'd have gone the way of Pulg and all such great men. Fat, power-racked, lieutenant-plagued, smothered with false-hearted dancing girls, and finally falling into the arms of religion. At least I'm saved that last chronic ailment, which is worse than the dropsy. He looked at Fafford narrowly. But how have you, old friend? Will you miss Vaudrace and your cobbled bed and your nightly tail weaving? Fafford frowned as the sloop plunged on northward and the salt spray dashed him. Not I, he said at last. There are always other tales to be woven. I served a god well. I dressed him in new clothes, and then I did a third thing. Who'd go back to being an acolyte after being so much more? You see, old friend, I really was Isaac. The Mouser arched his eyebrows. You were? Fafford nodded twice, most gravely. Finney, thank you.